What's good, y'all? Having it's always some shit, man. Every time you get on, there's always a new technical challenge. What's going on with you? Hope everybody's well. Shout out to you. What's up, Winston? See you in here, Brother Jamil, Ron. I'm listening. What's going on? Fabrication Unlimited. Got a few brothers in here early. Beautiful. Right? Destro, JBA, D-Rock. What's going on, man? Hybrid Ninjas, of course. Mr. Martez, Roaring Sun. What's going on? Like, share, subscribe, join, and donate if you will. Support the channel. You can see how to do it. You can support on Patreon, both the Onyx Report and the Institute for Black Male Studies. You can do a donation through YouTube, of course. You know, see the rest of it, Cash App, Venmo. Y'all know the deal. So support the channel if you would. Do super chat, something along those lines. And if nothing else, at least hit the like button. Right? A few people in here. What's up, MLR? Electrician 480, what's going on? Barry, what's up? Yeah, I was gonna come at y'all last night, but I just ended up falling out. So I said, man, I might have to do a Saturday and get this one in, because this one was kind of important to me. I thought it was important that we kind of observe something real quick in regard to some of this. Let me just check something real quick. Okay. Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, system's acting a little weird today. Hopefully it won't be too bad. But anyway, let's get to it. So, as you can see, Ice Cube and the Black Masculinist turn. Right? Well, let's start at the beginning. Black masculinism is a concept that I developed, and it principally deals with centering Black men and boys. But the problem with it is I think most people assume if anything, that is some kind of reversal of Black feminism. And it isn't. It's not the goal. If anything, I'm not concerned with centering and uplifting Black men at the expense of truth. I'm talking about what's accurate. So let's go to the definition. Now, this is something you can find on the blog. Boomer Hooked. Appreciate that support. Thank you. All right. This is something you can find on newblackmasculinities.wordpress.com. And I think I will go ahead and put it in that, especially for those of you interested in, buying any of the apparel or whatever. I want you guys to know what the term refers to, right? So it says Black masculinism is an intellectual, political, and an analytical / research tool that centers Black males across age, class, sexuality, and seeks to frame the actual state of Black male life in measurable terms. Measurable terms. This becomes incredibly important when we start to look at how Black men are normally talked about. A lot of opinion, a lot of frustration, a lot of anecdotal kind of stories about one guy somebody met or somebody they heard about from a story of a story. Advocating for Black male studies, we endeavor to empirically contextualize the major pillars that indicate Black male quality of life. Everything from carceral treatment, having to do with incarceration, criminal and civil sentencing, leading causes of death, health, employment, income, wealth status, education, violence, intimate partner violence / homicide, rape, housing, homelessness, types of labor, political approaches, wealth, family court impact, fatherhood, forms of protest, marriage, and the history of institutionally based treatment are just beginning points of analysis. I call for Black masculinism to highlight Black males' lives beyond society's assumptions, often rooted in stereotype and based on shorthand information, slanderous media representations, and even personal grudges. And this is important because you've had major feminist publications over the last few decades that were written with very little information, if any, written based off conjecture and had an almost global effect on the impact of how Black men were viewed. And this is important. So the need for Black masculinism isn't to slander women or to highlight men at the expense of truth. It's actually to highlight Black males' quality of life using measurable, accurate information, be it history-based or data-oriented. Right? That's the core idea of it. Now, in a public setting, I put forth that masculinism has actually become a reality in one way, shape, or form for many Black men, even if they've never heard of me or the concept formally. KMK, appreciate that support. Right. Ghetto user, what's going on? What's up, Winston? See you in there. Right. And it's important that we acknowledge this turn is not a product of YouTube. It's not a trend that just popped up because men woke up one day and decided they hate women. It's none of that. This is actually a response to conditions that have been in place for quite a while. And it's been impacting Black males' quality of life in ways that we have not always known how to articulate, right? So what do I mean when I talk about the Black masculinist turn? Well, one of the events that took place not long ago, and I've talked about it several times, a lot of YouTube has talked about it. David Price, appreciate that support. What's up to you? Has to do with an engagement that took place during the last presidential election with Ice Cube. Now, this has been talked about quite a bit, but I'm framing it in a slightly different way because, what's up, D-Rock? Because it had an impact that I don't know how fully we understood, right? So I'm going to play a clip from this, and it kind of showed a little bit. MLR, appreciate that support. Supporting our Black scholars as always. Much appreciated. I'm going to show a clip, and this kind of gives you a sense of what took place in a discussion Ice Cube had with, Cocktails with Queens. All right, many, only two of these women had I heard of prior to this show, but what does that really mean? So anyway, just to kind of give you a framework, this is a little bit of the discussion that kind of framed this. D-Rock, appreciate that support. So here we go.
Our situation.
So let me. I gotta ask this question. Because you're on this show with the cocktails with the queens, and there's a reason for that. It wasn't to have you defend or not defend Donald Trump. It was about. I care about what's in this contract with Black America for women, and it's not. We're not mentioned at all in the contract with Black America. And
you are mentioned. I mean, when you mention Black people, you mentioning Black women. So don't count yourself out.
No, that's not true.
That's like administration say that when they
Black people is not Black women. Black women are not included in Black people.
No, it's but that's like that's like you saying. That's like when the president says minorities, then he's including Black people. But we all know that that's not the case. Black women have specific needs that are not also being met. And we also feel that there should be some things that are specific to us and our plight as well. And
I understand that.
I feel like as a Black man, you can lead.
No,
I feel like
I just offered y'all to write a section up for it. I just said I don't mind if you guys help us. If you guys help us write.
Now, shout out to JBA. I appreciate that support. Shout out to Barry. Here's the thing. So in case you don't remember, so Cube wrote up this plan for Black America, and he offered it for both political parties to look at. The Democrats told him that they might get back with him if they got elected. Trump's people said that they'd sit down and listen. And of course, Cube got, labeled as being a Trump supporter when he basically said, I'm down to sit down with who's ever in power and willing to pay attention to what I'm talking about. Now, the blowback you just heard on this particular show had more to do with whether or not, Cube had included something for women. And he said, I did, in the sense that you're Black, because he didn't address gender specifically. One of the women actually pointed out in the clip you heard that no, Black women have very specific needs. And this is part of what I mean when I talk about flat Blackness. Appreciate that support, Durante. Other people use flat Blackness differently. If you listen to ADOS, they talk about flat Blackness in terms of, African Americans who are descendants of slavery here in North America, in terms of, in contrast to, say, immigrants. I talk about flat Blackness in regard to gender. And one of the things I notice is that when we talk about the Black experience, there's a generic idea of Blackness. And if we add in gender, we're only talking about women or LGBT. Right? It's almost as if men, particularly heterosexual men, have no stake in gender. And the expectation is you shut up and let those others, lead the discussion or foreground themselves and alienate you from the discourse. Now, Cube, again, wasn't bringing gender to the discussion. He was talking about a notion of Blackness that really is rooted in the late 60s and 70s, right? During the era where Blackness became beautiful. And it also became a political movement that was connected to a kind of sense of Pan-Africanism and a sense of, an indigenous reality here and so on and so forth. But there have been some massive changes to that I think many of us have drastically underestimated, and one of which is the rise of Black feminism. And so what you hear from these four ladies, well, I should say three, because Lisa Ray was quiet. She talked about this in other interviews. She was like, Cube started my career. I got nothing but respect for Cube. And so she spent most of the time just sitting there like, I don't even like the tone of this. But the point I'm getting at is there was this comfortable assumption that Cube wasn't going to get it right because he didn't talk specifically enough about Black women. But here's the point. He also didn't specifically talk about Black men. And we have this idea that Black men don't have any special needs, any concerns, or a particularly unique experience to themselves. And nothing can be further from the truth. If you don't understand that dynamic, look into the Black male political agenda, which I've renamed the 14-point Black male political agenda, and you can see how specific some Black male needs are. And there are plenty more that we just haven't added to the agenda. And we deal with that on the Onyx Report all the time. There's quite a bit that Black men need to talk about, but we're not conditioned to do so. Cube actually did what most Black men do. When talking about Black issues, they don't foreground their own gender experience because we're trained to think of Black maleness only in terms of Blackness. If you look at the interviews that took place and generally take place at most presidential elections, when they do finally get around to asking Black men what they want, usually sweeping under the rug that we're probably the most voter disenfranchised group due to incarceration. Most of the time when brothers answer them, they're generically Black answers. They're issues that pertain to Black America. Very seldom, except for maybe incarceration and police brutality, do they really focus on Black males. And even then, those Black men that bring up incarceration and police brutality still frame it in terms of Blackness. So you have 9 to 13 Black women killed by cops per year, 200 to 300 Black men killed by cops per year. And those Black men will still talk about police brutality, not as a Black male issue, as a Black issue, right? And I've said this before. We don't do that in other scenarios. We talk about breast cancer. 2% of Black breast cancer patients are Black men, but we don't frame it as a Black issue. We frame it as a Black women's issue. But the point is, Black men do not know how to really articulate our issues in terms of both our racial experience and our gender. We've been trained to think about it generically, whereas Black women have been trained to think about themselves in very particular ways, and they advocate for a political agenda that is specific to their race, their gender, and depending on the circumstances, their sexuality. We have not learned to do that. We've learned to be shamed into silence when that comes up. And Cube did something that I rarely hear men do. He at least spoke back up and said, no, you're not going to separate this out. This is a Black agenda. And they talked him down anyway. Now, they apologized a little bit later. And I'll play a clip of that real quick. They did apologize in a later show where they actually said this.
On the way out. And listen, this is something we could talk about. Maybe we should invite Ice Cube back to the show. I'd like to apologize to him for how it went last time. I think we were all just emotional and it was never meant for any disrespect. But I still think that he has valid points and valid efforts that need to be respected. And you know what I mean? Like, he deserves that. So let's move on to the next story.
Yeah, it was a quick apology. They didn't spend long on it. And I personally think Lisa Ray has something to do with that. Personally, AKs and curtains, appreciate that support. But that said, right, what I mean by the masculinist turn is I think that a lot of people were shocked at that moment because even though we've heard and grown up with this feminism, even if it wasn't called feminism, even if it was just, happening in our families with women who grew up on Oprah and Terry McMillan books and movies and never actually read a feminist or a publication, they still had a feminist sensibility. Right, that was mass produced and disseminated through popular media, right? And we all grew up with it as young Black men. We didn't necessarily name it. We just, became very familiar with, Black female uplift, right? Even in those scenarios, we didn't expect it to get where it got to. And when Cube is pushing for this Black uplift agenda and is shouted down because of the lack of particularity to Black women's experiences, even though he didn't really formally bring up gender in any context, not even to include his own demographic, it brought a reality to most of us that there's been an irrevocable shift in how Blackness is practiced, whether we talk about it or not. It is practiced in a manner that distinctly separates itself from how we understood it in the 60s and 70s. Now it is overwhelmingly gendered, but gendered in terms that excludes the very Black men that often find themselves in the news due to loss of life, loss of freedom, loss of liberty, loss of access to the resources and abilities that other citizens get. It's overwhelmingly heterosexual Black males that find themselves in the news lacking what everyone else gets. And even though Blackness is being reframed in terms of a gender experience that doesn't include them, people have no problem using Black men's experiences to push themselves into the foreground. Quickly bait and switch the conversation away from what Black men experience for their own self-aggrandizement, their own advancement in society. And those very Black men that are the cause of the news gets pushed to the back. Matter of fact, I'll ask you, when we heard the Cocktails and Queens interview with Cube, how many Black women did you hear oppose those women and how they characterized Cube? I heard a few, but you tell me, how many? Was there any kind of mass statement that, no, we're not going to allow this Black feminism to fracture how we identify as a community? We're not going to allow the silencing of a Black gender experience as it pertains to heterosexual males as if it doesn't exist. Because I'll give you a quick example so we can get to the heart of this. When you hear people say that Black men, heterosexual Black men, have no stake in a gender discourse or sexuality discourse, let's understand something. Black men, gendered in the very framework, the very term Black men, and sex. Look at lynching, right? Let's look at lynching. From slavery to the mid-20th century, the majority of lynchings that took place also had a component that had to do with violating the scrotum, the penis, the anus of Black men, overwhelmingly when they were lynched. And the fact that the majority of Black folk who were lynched, the overwhelming majority, were Black males. It's not like there were equal representations of every demographic we can think of that were evenly lynched. No. As a matter of fact, even when you start to talk about the lynching of Black women, when you delve into those stories, often they were looking for Black men. So it's a kind of, and it's the same thing that happens with police brutality. It is very much targeted on Black men. Shout out to James Sedanius. Look into that work. Shout out to Errol Miller. Shout out to Tommy Curry. You can see there is a gender component to this. But when we're told that the gender discussion is officially being had, you need to shut up and sit in the background if you're straight and if you're Black and male. And that is ridiculous. There is a gendered experience for straight Black men. There is a sexual experience for straight Black men. And there is a need for a justice movement that goes beyond the surface level discussions about police brutality and delves into why straight Black men are feared and targeted to the degree they are, to the point where you can be beat up, incriminated, incarcerated simply for standing someplace, right? There is a gendered experience there, and it is particular, it is distinct, but we don't talk about it that way. And Black men themselves have not learned to talk about it that way. So in response to this discussion between Cube and the Cocktails with Queens, there was what I call a masculinist turn, a Black masculinist turn, where we as a community, whether we want to use that term or not, watching this, had to realize that it was at such a point where how gender is conventionally defined separated us. Black men's gender was dismissed, and the pressure on Cube to foreground Black women as the only acceptable gender analysis, gender component to his agenda was pushed. And lately we've only seen more of it, right? The push for a Black vice president, right? The push for a Black Supreme Court justice. No Black men were upset at that. Nobody, had any protests in the street. No Black men held any protests to deny that there should be a Black VP or a Black Supreme Court justice. But we watched the push for those particular people, specifically on the basis of race and gender. Even though many of us don't even feel like the Black men we've seen in those positions really represented Black America. But we didn't really push against that. But I think what we underestimated is how much of those pushes were part of a distinct feminist ideology that really is kind of rooted in an idea that we have not properly framed. It is an idea that is irrespective of Black men and boys. We are incidental to that particular agenda. And this is where we find ourselves now. It's been culminating for years. It has cultivated a very particular type of hatred, much of which we drastically underestimate the extent of. Let me see. I'll give you an example. One of my colleagues posted this. Shout out to him. He posted it as only to his friends on Facebook, so I'm not going to call him out because he didn't make it public. But nevertheless, I'm going to go through this a little bit. This is a piece from Bell Hooks and her book, We Real Cool. Right? And in response to a clip or a section, she pulls out a native son. She says, "This nihilistic sentiment is the heart of the matter. Since so many Black males, especially young Black males, feel that they are living on borrowed time, just waiting to be locked down or taken out, they may as well embrace their fate, kill and be killed. Taught to believe the world is against them, that they are doomed to be victims, they assume the posture of a victimizer. First, embracing the ideals of patriarchal masculinity that make domination acceptable, they then draw upon misogyny and sexism to experience their first use of violence, psychological or physical, to control another being." Right? Yet it is often in relationships with females, particularly romantic bonds, that Black males experience a disruption of the cool pose. They respond with anger and sexual predation to maintain their dominator stance. Now, my colleague framed this properly. He said this is basically hate speech. So Black men are nihilistic because of this, they'll adopt a kill or be killed attitude. This forces them to adopt fictive masculine postures where if their masculinity is challenged, they rape you or beat or abuse you. I truly believe that so many white feminists like the work of Bell Hooks because it allows them to rationalize their racist aversion to Black men through Black feminism. Absolutely. And if you look into Dr. Tommy Curry's work, especially on subcultural violence theory, he talks about the very particular white scholars that produced many of these talking points, these rhetorical positions with no evidence, and the degree to which Black feminist scholars in the 70s and 80s wholeheartedly took those various quotations, those various arguments, incorporated it in their works like Bell Hooks, and came out with drivel like this that characterizes Black men based on racist white scholarship, that frames us as monsters that are victimized and have to victimize because we're victimized. But there's not one citation in that whole passage that I read from Bell Hooks, which she was not one to do on a regular basis. And I find it funny because I was reading, somebody had done a little Facebook post on Kevin Samuels, and they were talking about how frustrated and ridiculous his statements were about women and how much hatred had to go with that. And I'm thinking, you're upset with a guy on YouTube that basically blew up in the last 2 years. But we've been reading this shit in college university classes since the fucking 1980s. When I paid for graduate school, I had to sit and listen to this. I had to sit and read these works and then argue with feminist professors who were twice my age about things I wasn't even born into that they're referencing. In the college classrooms, in graduate school classrooms, I had to argue against the mischaracterization of Black men by professional, degreed, studied, quote unquote, feminists. You know what that feels like? To be 19 years old, sitting in a graduate program or 21. I think it was 21. Yeah. Started in the same. Okay. So to be 21 years old, arguing with someone who's your grandmother's age, who looks like your grandmother and who's telling you that you are the monster that white scholarship has always said you were. Right? But y'all mad about a dude on YouTube from 2 years ago? From the last 2 years? Really? So we're going to disregard the last 40 years plus of what Black men have been reading in classes, watching on television, seeing in films, having their own daughters and sons re-invoked because that's what they think Black maleness is. But nobody has anything to say about that. So when I talk about the Black masculinist turn, I'm talking about the moment, not when this started, but the moment many Black men realized that there's an irrevocable change. And not only how Black men are perceived, but in the perception of Black women as a distinct and separate group from Black America. Jeremy Duncan, appreciate the support. Says it's time for brothers to speak and be unapologetic. Continue your work, Dr. T, and many others. Thank you. Will do. What's up, Dr. Thunder? Good to see you in here. Black Uru, always good to have you. I need to holler at you, man. I want to talk to you about next Wednesday. So let's reach out to each other through BGS. Mr. Blue Collar, appreciate that support. All right, Dr. Thunder, appreciate the support. just catching up a little bit on some of the donations. It said Black Rouge says Lisa Ray was the worst of the four because she knew Cube was righteous and generous, but she still allowed the rest of that vicious coven of hers to attack him. That's typical Black female treachery. She talked about it on another show, but right, she didn't really defend him on her platform. I think she probably talked to them in the background, but what does that really mean when the moment happens, right? Especially when we're told that we need to protect in public, and yet we don't see the same kind of thing happening with us. This is basically what we're looking at. And I've called many of these black feminist nationalists. And the reason I started calling them that is because in the last 7 or 8 years, I noticed that they were taking a very distinct kind of imagined aspirational nationalism. It wasn't rooted in a physical separation per se. What it is you have a both and approach. In other words, you have this idea where they want to be, in the Black community to the extent it's useful to them, but separate from it to the extent that it benefits them, right? It's a very distinct type of ideological nationalism that is rooted in class aspirationalism. It's rooted in a superiority framework, but it is distinctly separate from Black men, unless it's convenient to not be separate. This is, again, what I refer to in terms of flat blackness, right? But it's a kind of separate nationalism where they want advancements strictly in their own name. And guess what? That's what we've been seeing. And we underestimate that as well. Because starting in 2020, when I started pointing out these very distinct types of grants that were going to small business owners that were in the Black community only, mainly for Black females, many of us just kind of dismissed it. And then Goldman Sachs dropped. What was it, 10 billion? Specifically for Black women. MasterCard, Google, Visa, and a number of others. And that didn't even count all the programs that started to pop up, these test programs that started to pop up that wanted to, give Black women in particular, single mothers at that, certain dollars, certain monies, resources. And as a single father, I found that interesting because nobody was trying to give me resources raising my son alone. Most Black men I knew who were single fathers, nobody extended them resources. Nobody extended them programs, grants, opportunities, nothing. If anything, when I would actually when I would engage Black businesses like childcare, things of that nature, they went out their way to tell each other about discounts that were available. They wouldn't even share that with me. And that's social. That wasn't even institutional. That was just socially. The perception of Black men and women as distinctly different, let alone Black men being less than, servile, or perceived as a lesser being, is something that many of us don't want to accept, but we grapple with it on a daily. The men in the comment section can tell you stories about being dismissed at the workplace, in the family. And we're 4 generations into this at the very least. At the very least. From boomers to Generation X to millennials to Generation Z, you're seeing practices handed down that are often predicated on ideas of Black male inferiority. Nobody cares. Black men are starting to grumble about it. And the first response we get is to be ignored. The second response we get is to be downplayed and dismissed, to be gaslighted, to be told that there's nothing there and this is just made up. It isn't. But because we don't have access to the same type of popular culture, frameworks, we don't have television channels or magazines that pay attention to us. It took free social media for us to compare notes. And as we're starting to speak out amongst ourselves, and we have people coming into these spaces trying to either popularize, or I shouldn't say popularize, they're trying to either profit in one way, shape, or form off of these discussions, or dismiss them and downplay them altogether. Black men are still starting to speak up, and they're slowly starting to organize. And here's the thing. I called it Black masculinism, but don't get it twisted. I didn't create it. I named something that I identified was happening, and it's not limited to YouTube. It's not limited to Twitter. It's not limited to Facebook. It's happening amongst different groups of Black men, many of whom aren't even connected to one another. Black men who are traveling internationally, Black men who are devout nationalists, devout revolutionaries, but are marrying women from other countries. These are not incidental, accidental things. These are Black men responding to conditions in their environment despite being told that what they're experiencing isn't happening. We're told that, it's just rain, over tasting urine. And brothers have decided to no longer stand out and be told that they don't know what piss smells like. So they found other means. And this is how Black men have been moving, with their feet, very quietly. Much of that because we never had a vocabulary to explain ourselves. We were never asked. Those women didn't ask Cube if there was a distinct experience for men that he put into this or didn't put into this. And by the way, he didn't. But they didn't ask him that. They assumed his position and then assumed that his position was lacking, that it lacked their gender experience. But he didn't even include his own gender experience. But that wasn't even up for discussion because they didn't need to. Black men don't need to be talked about. As long as you talk about incarceration, they're in there somewhere. I've actually heard scholars at conferences, at Black Studies conferences, say there's nothing new to talk about with Black men. We've talked about enough. Everything we've already created for them stands. We don't need to talk about them anymore. If we need to come back to that, we'll grab an old lecture or paper from 20 years ago. That will suffice. I've had people tell me that the discussions that involve Black scholarship and even the manosphere are to be dismissed and not to be taken seriously. I've been told I'm not to be taken seriously because I deign to involve discussions that come out of social media. But here's the thing. I've never in my lifetime seen Black men speak out about their own conditions, ever. When Black men did speak out about injustice, they spoke for the Black community. I have rarely, even in those protests where you see men holding "I am a man," when you got to the core of what they were talking about, it was still Black community issues. They didn't even know how to talk about the specifics of their needs. Scholars like Errol Miller, Robert Staples, these cats who've been writing for decades about Black men's experiences were downplayed, even by other Black male scholars. Black men didn't even talk about Black men's issues. Even in the barbershop, we were trying to figure out how to, but how long did it take before that got co-opted and became accessible to everybody, so to speak? Brotherly love, appreciate that support. Shout out to Rob Black. Thank you for that support as well. Says some of these Black women are trying to seek acceptance in the white male-dominated society by sacrificing the Black woman image. We are not like them. Okay. Soul Sir, Fiverr, appreciate the support. Says, I love your productive insights, Dr. T. Thank you. Appreciate that. Appreciate that. Constructive X, appreciate the donation. Says, appreciate your dedication to Black men. Yeah. Yeah. But this absence of how to talk about Black men and this invisibility that we've been given as far as the nuances of our experiences in families, in relationships, in dating and courting, even just in society, within institutions, the absence of the dialogue, the absence of the vocabulary that's uniquely positioned to highlight Black male experiences, the absence of that has produced a very separate, fractured kind of approach, especially to politics, but even social realities. It's separate, it's fractured. There's almost a kind of Black female solipsism that has come about, which I think the Cocktails with Queens exemplified. The only reason there was pushback among them was because one of them had actually had her career started by Cube. She had respect for him, but let's be real. She's also looking for her next opportunity. And the last thing she wanted to do is disassociate from Ice Cube. Because he may have had a movie coming up that she would have liked to have been in. Let's be real. There's a practical reality to Lisa Ray's behavior. He started her career. He may continue to be useful to her career. She's no fool. But short of her friendship with him or her personal aspirations, I think that those are the only things that led to some degree of pushback from within the group. Right? But plenty of people jumped in on slandering Cube and so on and so forth. And we talked about it for a little bit, but we moved on. And I'm saying, I don't think we should move on that quickly. That was a key cultural moment that highlighted that there is a difference between how Black men and women see our current reality and where we fit into it. Black men are learning to include themselves beyond surface level discussions. Black women have long since learned to do it and have actively participated, many, not all, have actively participated in alienating Black men from the discourse. When they perceive themselves as advancing in society, particularly along lines of class, they don't include Black men in that dynamic. You've not heard one protest movement in the last 2 years saying that, no, if you're going to have these programs that advance Black women, we need them to advance Black men. So at the very least, my daughter has someone to marry on her level. You've not heard one movement push that. Not one. That's what I mean by political solipsism. If it advances women and girls, they're all for it. If it ignores their boys, you ain't heard shit. Nobody responded. Nobody said a word. And everybody's fine with it. Black men themselves don't even complain. We might complain about the lack of opportunity, but then very quickly someone will come up in the discussion and say, well, we just need to man up. Word. Every group of men that you idolize in terms of their business acumen, their skill, whatever, they've all had support. Generational support, inheritance, governmental support, policy, all of the men that have been business moguls that we put up on pedestals amongst men, all of them had fucking support. All of them. They come from a context that is so rooted in support that they don't even see it as support. And this tends to happen when people get that. And yes, that does include Black women in the last 4 to 5 decades. Absolutely. I've done a show, BGS and I did a show a few weeks ago talking about the lists of benefits that went to poor Black women, to middle-class Black women, and to Black women as a whole. Much of which was a product of white feminism and the contract between Black women and white women. White women offered advancement for Black female support, and they got it. This is why most Black women can operate and use Black feminist talking points, but they've never actually read a Black feminist text. It was predicated off an arrangement with white feminists, an exchange, public support for access. Damned what Black men need. Damned what their sons, their grandsons, husbands, boyfriends, fathers, none of that mattered. And if we had a cohesive Black community, that might be workable. It still might be workable if we had a cohesive community, but we don't. Eventually, especially after a couple generations, the perception of Black men, again, going back to subculture violence theory, the idea that we are the monsters racist white scholarships say we are. The perspective then became, well, these niggas ain't shit. He can't do what I can do. Look at us. We're going to school and record. You know what? You don't want to hear that from me. Why don't we actually hear it from someone else? Why don't we hear it from someone else who can articulate how many Black women today think of this better than I can?
What do you think the challenge is that women are having, Black women in particular, when it comes to becoming a wife?
Keeping it 100,
Yes.
There's not enough eligible Black males who fit the needs of Black women. By the time you dissect the demographics.
Hold on. And by the way, it's not that they don't fit the needs of Black women. They don't fit the wants of Black women. The wants have been socially framed. They've been bolstered. They've been communicated and distributed out in popular media. All of these movies and television shows where you see people living in fucking mansions and driving cars that in real life they don't even leave the studio with as actors and actresses. That's where the want comes from. But the wealthy in any community is a small population. Look, in any framework, whatever you identify as rare and valuable is going to be in the minority. That is the basis of how we determine value. So if you're talking about beauty, well, when you get down to it, the reason we use a numbered system among men, even though it's dismissed as misogynistic, is it highlights the fact that beautiful people, even though they're born and they don't often have to necessarily become beautiful, even if they're born beautiful, they're still in the minority. If you're going to talk about how you like women with a certain body shape, guess what? They're often in the minority, whatever that ideal body shape is. And the same thing happens with money. So when men are determined or to be valuable on the basis of how much money they have, we use a standard that is rare. We generically say 6 figures. We talked about this for months on my show. 6 figures today doesn't mean what it meant in the 1980s. For the most part, if you become 6 figures today, it means that it's low 6 figures. If you cross 100,000, it means your bills are paid. That's really all it means. It doesn't mean you're driving a Lamborghini, but still, Even for those black men that achieve that, you're talking about less than 10%. And yet this is the measuring stick that all black men are measured against. And if we say we want a beauty standard or a cooperation standard, that's considered misogynistic. But when women say they want high profile men that have a high level income, there's no problem with that. Even though, even amongst women, there are still more black men that make that than black women. When we went through the BLS data, BJS and I did this over a year ago. Went through the BLS data, we showed that at every age group from 18 to 65, black men made more than black women for those black men that were employed. Yes, unemployment is higher for black men, but for black men that are working, they do better. And as opposed to that being seen as a means for whereby we actually begin to frame relationships, no, we're still going to overwhelmingly fixate on the top 9% of black men and then say, because there's not more than 9%, black men are failing. But the reality is no group has an extreme, nobody has 90% of six-figure income earners. It's fucking ridiculous. That's not what's happening. But this is the comfortable narrative that these women are allowed to give. Let's continue.
Of finances, sexual orientation, what you end up drilling down into, because black women tend to want to marry black men.
Right.
So black women are excelling. They're getting accelerated degrees, graduate degrees, doctorate degrees. They're starting businesses. Black women are running circles around men.
And this is completely, it's just straight bullshit. It's straight bullshit. Right? They're not running circles. There are more that are getting degrees, yes. But when you look at income, see, part of the issue, and I've said this before, is if you live in Atlanta, New York, LA, and you see these women congregating at high-level restaurants making six figures, yeah, then it seems like, wow, they're running circles. But when you actually look at the data, no. We do have different types of labor. We do have different educational experiences. But the point that I'm getting at has nothing to do with any of that. The entitlement that she came to the table with, that has readily accepted. And shout out to MTR, who pointed out accurately, this was the same woman not long ago who was talking about those very women that she's idolizing now, that are her primary base. They were the reason she quit being a dating counselor or dating, whatever you call it, whatever. But the entitlement that I'm talking about, the entitlement that went into this whole perspective on how to even look at black men, feeds the political solipsism that alienates black men from the discourse. As far as these types of middle-class, aspirational black feminists are concerned. And again, they're pushing from a distinct separation from black men when convenient, and a collaboration, again, when convenient. And at some point, we have to call this shit out for what it is. And that is the black masculinist term. The moment when you realize that the definition of blackness as we understood it in the 60s and 70s is gone. It has irrevocably changed. It is now gendered, but black men are not allowed to have gender. It is now sexed, but black men are not allowed to have sex unless they're LGBT. But when the majority of the people that are killed, that are disenfranchised in terms of voting, that are incarcerated, that are left out of the employment bracket, when you look at each of those groups and you find that the majority of those people who are at the absolute bottom are heterosexual black men, then there is something to be said about a race, gendered, and sexed experience for heterosexual black men. There is something to be said because clearly, institutionally, we're distinct enough to be sought after for underdevelopment. So how exactly is there no discourse for heterosexual black men, and yet heterosexual black men are identified, targeted, and at the bottom of many of the most important issues that we can bring up? How is it that those groups can be targeted for underdevelopment, but have nothing to contribute to a discourse on gender and sex as straight black men? Shut up, be quiet, allow us to use our experience for our own advancement at your expense, and develop a whole new sensibility, a whole new definition of blackness that marginally includes you when we want to, when the numbers of your decline are useful to a point we're making. But then we're going to push policy that has nothing to do with you, or we're going to push for candidates that might get into key positions to advance us. And then we're going to tell you it's empowerment. And if you don't support the empowerment, you're a misogynist. Okay? And many black men have gone with that program. Why? Many of us were raised by the very women that are doing this. We don't know how to go against mama. So we do it. We support it. We're patted on the head. We're told that we're good men as long as we shut up and do so. We wake up the next morning in the same fucking position. And then we're told that we're trifling because of it. Anyway, what I wanted to get across today is that these turns, what I call the masculinist turn, they're not new. Shout out to Face Towards Enemy for the support. It says they Black women value education over success. Many Black women get their master's degree to avoid and delay their near defaulted undergraduate status student loan debt. Can't say I haven't seen that. Shout out to Rob Black for the support. Meant to say some Black women are sacrificing the Black male image for acceptance in this white culture. Certain Black women are trying to become the face of Blackness as they silence Black men while using our pain for sympathy/profit. Very much so. Yeah. You know, when I talk about these cultural moments, they are important. You know, and there are a lot of them that take place, you know, that we can talk about. And I'm just talking about cultural moments as it relates to pop culture. We can talk about them in politics too, you know, but I'm just going to use a couple from pop culture. You know, the moment when Richard Pryor said he wasn't going to use the N-word anymore, that was a cultural moment. The moment Eddie Murphy talked about Johnny Carson's divorce, that was a cultural moment. And if anything, it was a Black masculinist moment. Because I had not heard anybody publicly talk about the way family courts impact men differently. By a Black man at that. In a space where you could not deny him his voice. Right? And there are many of those kinds of cultural moments that have significance. What I'm doing tonight is I'm adding to that list the Ice Cube conversation. The Ice Cube conversation with Cocktails with Queens. It was a significant cultural moment. It was a Black masculinist turn that many of us just kind of saw, talked about. We saw the negativity in it and we left it alone. But it was more than that. It was a moment where we had to accept that the very idea that many of us thought was still in operation in terms of how we define community and Blackness had irrevocably changed. It became gendered, it became sexed, but only in a way that excluded Black men from participating, that required Black male silence, but yet required our usefulness when it comes to advancing other demographics to our detriment. And the problem is, it doesn't have to be that. I'm not saying you can't have conversations about different demographics, that we can't advance the positions of each one. It just doesn't need to be at the expense of Black men. And that seems to be the most popular frame for it. The hostility and contempt for Black men is so palpable and accepted. And it's accepted as part of the way you get ahead. Even if you're in the academy, you can advance your career strictly off of contempt for Black men. It's acceptable. It's acceptable in popular culture and entertainment. It's acceptable even amongst news anchors and you know, anyway. This is the kind of stuff that really bothers me. Because I think at the end of the day, the kind of damage that this does might not be able to be something that can be turned back. But that's not my point in raising this. My point in raising this is hoping that more Black men will actually start to pay attention to their own experiences and actually participate in the discourse around framing how to perceive our own lives, how to talk about it. And contrary to popular opinion, it's not about denigrating anybody else, but it is about actively loving our own selves enough to say, wait a minute. Maybe what's been going on with us has not been properly framed by other demographics. I've read books that were written by feminists who wanted to tell me how Black men should explain their experience and should talk about their own lives in a way that was comfortable to Black female sensibilities. What kind of fucking nerve does that take? You're actually publishing books as feminists on how men should talk about this. I think I mentioned this a few years ago. I went to an American Men's Association conference, and they, you know, it was the first time going. I was supposed to go with a couple brothers, but they stood me up. But I was there. And I went in and sat in on one of their main meetings, their executive board meeting they had publicly at the conference. And the subject that they were on for at least a good hour was how to keep men who were not feminists out of the organization. How to make sure that they didn't get the wrong kind of men. And the majority of the executive board were women, were feminists at that. The whole conference around, men's studies, as far as that association was concerned, and that was for the year that I attended that conference at the very least, was all fixated around, toxic masculinity. These were not discussions that came out of in some kind of organic way what Black men or men in general were talking about. They came out of what feminists and mainstream society wanted men to talk about. And so the preoccupation of the board was keeping the wrong kind of men out that would challenge those narratives. And that's what I see happening. So what I'm pushing for in this space, what's up, BGS, is an attempt to actually push away from that and have this and continue to have the conversation that we're having, but to do so for more than just profit, for more than just, being, releasing frustration, but doing so with the intention of improving the quality of life for Black men and boys. That needs to be the first priority, whether it's done politically, whether it's done spiritually, socially. I don't even give a damn, because I think it needs to happen across all those different frameworks and more. But we have to walk into it with the right purpose. We have to walk into it purposeful about that. And if it's just about sex, or if it's just about cash, I'm not saying it can't be about those things, but if that's all it's about, we're missing out on a golden opportunity. Because again, I've not seen this in my entire lifetime. I've never seen this many Black men speak up against their own denigration, even within their own community. I never thought I would see it. I never even had a framework to allow me to say that this is something that needs to happen. Never. So the moment has a lot of possibility. I hope we don't waste it. And I hope we're able to take the momentum that we are developing and push it into an area that actually seeks to improve our quality of life. Hope you'll join me in that and voice your concerns, your issues, or your contributions to the discourse in the comment section. Support the channels that are pushing for this, and let's move it beyond where it is now to a level where it actually can be helpful to Black men and boys. Y'all have a good one.